Why do conflicts emerge from a shared beginning? It's a deceptively simple question, one that quietly unsettles the way we think about history, belief, and identity. Imagine three of the world's largest religions, followed by billions of people, all tracing their roots back to a single origin. Not three separate inventions, not three unrelated traditions, but three branches growing from the same seed. And yet, over time, those branches have diverged so deeply that they sometimes stand in tension with one another. This is not a story about deciding who is right or wrong. It is a story about understanding why differences emerge, even when the foundation is the same. At the heart of this story are three major faith traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Despite their differences, they share a profound and often overlooked connection, a common spiritual ancestor, and a shared belief in one God. That ancestor is Abraham, a figure revered across all three traditions. His story does not begin with division, but with unity, an act of radical faith in a single, unseen God at a time when the world was filled with many gods and competing beliefs. In many ways, Abraham represents the moment when human understanding of the divine began to shift toward monotheism, toward the idea that there is one ultimate source behind everything. But Abraham's journey was not just theological, it was deeply personal. He left behind his homeland, his security, and everything familiar, guided only by a promise he could not yet see fulfilled. This act of trust became the symbolic foundation for generations to come. It wasn't merely about belief, it was about commitment, about stepping into uncertainty with conviction. From this single story, a vast historical and spiritual legacy would unfold. As time passed, Abraham's legacy continued through his descendants, and this is where the narrative begins to branch. According to tradition, Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. From Isaac came the lineage that would shape Judaism, a tradition rooted in covenant, law, and a deep sense of historical identity. The descendants of Isaac carried forward the idea of a chosen people bound by a sacred agreement with God, preserving their beliefs through centuries of hardship, exile, and renewal. On the other hand, Ishmael's lineage holds a central place in Islamic tradition. In this perspective, Ishmael is not a secondary figure but an essential part of the divine plan. His descendants are linked to the eventual Zuhur of Muhammad, who is believed to have received the final and complete revelation from God. This interpretation does not reject Abraham's story, it expands it, offering another path that remains connected to the same origin. Meanwhile, Christianity emerges from within the Jewish tradition itself. It does not begin as something separate, but as a movement within Judaism. The earliest followers of Jesus Christ were Jewish, and their beliefs were deeply rooted in Jewish scripture and expectation. However, over time, a significant shift occurred. Christians came to believe that Jesus was not only a teacher or prophet, but the fulfillment of God's promise, a savior whose role transcended political or national boundaries. This belief marked a turning point. While Judaism continued to await a Messiah who would restore and transform the world in a more tangible historical sense, Christianity reinterpreted that expectation through the life and teachings of Jesus. What began as a shared tradition gradually evolved into a distinct faith, with its own theology, practices, and identity. What we see then is not a clean separation from the beginning, but a gradual divergence. Like a tree growing over centuries, the roots remain intertwined even as the branches stretch in different directions. Each tradition maintains a connection to Abraham, to the idea of one God, and to a shared narrative of faith. Yet each also develops its own interpretation of what that faith means, how it should be lived, and how divine truth is revealed. This leads us to a crucial insight. The differences between these religions are not necessarily contradictions at their core, but variations in interpretation shaped by history, culture, and human experience. The same foundational story can be understood in multiple ways, depending on the context in which it is told and retold. Over generations, these interpretations solidify into distinct systems of belief, each carrying its own internal logic and sense of truth. And perhaps this is where the deeper question lies, not in the origin itself, but in the journey that follows. How does a single idea evolve when it passes through different societies, languages, and historical moments? How does a shared belief become multiple identities? The answer is not simple, because it involves not only theology, but also human nature, the need for belonging, for meaning, and for continuity. If you find yourself reflecting on these questions, you're not alone. This story is not just about the past, it continues to shape the world we live in today. And understanding it requires more than memorizing facts. It requires curiosity, openness, and a willingness to see beyond surface differences. If you'd like to explore more stories like this, where history, belief, and human experience intersect, consider following the channel and subscribing for future insights. Not to tell you what to believe, but to help you see more clearly why people believe differently. Because sometimes, understanding is not about reaching a final answer, but about learning how to ask better questions. And in this case, the question remains quietly powerful. How can three paths, all beginning from the same route, lead us to such different destinations? As the story continues to unfold from that shared origin, history arrives at a turning point, one that does not simply add another chapter, but reshapes the entire narrative. It is here that a single figure emerges at the center of agreement and disagreement at the same time, a figure whose life would redefine how millions understand faith, salvation, and the nature of divine promise. That figure is Jesus Christ. To understand why this moment becomes such a decisive split, we need to step back into the expectations that existed long before his arrival. Within the Jewish tradition, the idea of a Messiah was already deeply rooted. But this Messiah was not imagined in abstract or purely spiritual terms. He was expected to be a leader, a figure of authority, someone who would restore the nation, bring justice, and re-establish a sense of order and sovereignty. In a world shaped by occupation, instability, and longing for renewal, the Messiah represented hope in a very tangible sense. He was not just a spiritual guide, he was a promise of transformation in the real political world. And then, into that expectation, Jesus appeared, but not in the way many had anticipated. He did not gather armies or seek political power. He did not attempt to overthrow empires or claim a throne. Instead, his message moved in a completely different direction. He spoke of love, forgiveness, humility, and inner transformation. He focused not on changing external structures, but on reshaping the human heart. His teachings challenged not only authority, but also assumptions about what true power looks like. For many within the Jewish community, this difference was not a small detail, it was fundamental. If the Messiah was meant to restore a nation and establish justice in visible, concrete ways, then a figure who avoided political power and emphasized spiritual renewal did not align with that expectation. As a result, Jesus was not recognized as the Messiah within Judaism, and the tradition continued to hold on to its original understanding of what that role should be. At the same time, something else was happening among those who followed him. For early Christians, these very differences became the reason for belief rather than rejection. They saw in Jesus not a failed Messiah, but a redefined one. To them, he did not come to build a kingdom of this world, but to reveal a deeper reality, one that transcended borders, identities, and political systems. His life, death, and what they believed to be his resurrection became the foundation of an entirely new understanding of salvation. This is where the divergence becomes clear. The same figure is seen through three distinct lenses. In Judaism, Jesus is not accepted as the promised Messiah. In Christianity, he becomes the central figure, the Son of God and the embodiment of divine love. And within Islam, he is honored as an important prophet, a messenger chosen by God, but not divine. Three perspectives, each internally consistent, each rooted in its own theological framework, yet all connected to the same historical presence. What makes this moment so significant is not just the disagreement itself, but the way it shapes everything that follows. From this point onward, the three traditions are no longer simply branches growing in parallel. They begin to form distinct paths, each carrying its own interpretation of the same foundational story. And yet, even in divergence, the connection remains. The questions they ask are still similar. What is the nature of God? How does divine truth reach humanity? What does it mean to live a faithful life? As history moves forward, another voice enters the narrative, one that does not erase what came before, but seeks to reframe and complete it. In the 7th century, in a very different cultural and historical context, the figure of Muhammad emerges. His message is not presented as something entirely new, but as a continuation of the same line of revelation that began with Abraham and passed through figures like Moses and Jesus. Within Islamic belief, this continuity is essential. Muhammad is understood as the final prophet, the last in a long silsila of messengers who conveyed God's guidance to humanity. The idea is not that previous messages were false, but that they were either incomplete or, over time, interpreted in ways that moved away from their original intent. In this sense, Muhammad's role is both confirmatory and corrective. He reaffirms the core principle of monotheism while also presenting what is believed to be the final, preserved form of divine revelation. This belief carries profound implications. If Muhammad is the last prophet, then the chain of revelation is considered complete. There are no further messages to come, no additional figures who will alter or expand the core teachings. This creates a sense of closure, a zavashonist that defines Islamic theology. The Quran, as the revealed text, is seen as the final articulation of God's will, providing guidance not only for spiritual life but for social, legal, and ethical dimensions as well. At the same time, this development establishes Islam as a distinct and independent system. While it remains deeply connected to the same origin as Judaism and Christianity, it also forms its own structure, its own practices, laws, and worldview. It is no longer just another branch. It is a fully developed tradition with its own identity, shaped by its historical context and theological framework. And so, the narrative that began with a single figure and a single act of faith has now expanded into three major paths. Each one carries forward the idea of one God. Each one traces its lineage back to Abraham. Each one seeks to answer the same fundamental questions about existence, purpose, and morality. Yet the answers they provide are not identical. They reflect different interpretations, different emphases, and different understandings of what divine truth means. What becomes increasingly clear is that divergence does not necessarily imply contradiction in a simple sense. Instead, it reflects the complexity of human engagement with something as vast and abstract as the divine. When a message passes through different cultures, languages, and historical conditions, it evolves, not always in opposition, but often in variation. If you've been following this journey so far, you're beginning to see how a shared origin can lead to multiple outcomes without losing its connection to the past. And if this kind of exploration resonates with you, where history and belief intersect in unexpected ways, consider subscribing and following the channel. Not as a way to settle debates, but as a way to deepen your understanding of them. Because the story is far from over. What began as a divergence in belief will soon take on a physical dimension, grounded in a specific place on Earth, a place where faith, history, and identity converge in ways that are both powerful and deeply complex. As these three paths continued to develop, each shaped by its own understanding of revelation, identity, and purpose, the story gradually moved from abstract belief into something more tangible. Faith, which once lived primarily in ideas and teachings, began to attach itself to specific places, Geography became sacred, memory became anchored in stone, and nowhere is this transformation more visible or more complex than in the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not just a location on a map. It is a convergence point, a place where history, belief, and identity overlap so intensely that they become almost inseparable. To understand why this city holds such weight, you have to see it not as one story, but as many stories layered on top of each other, each one deeply meaningful to those who carry it. For Judaism, Jerusalem stands at the very center of spiritual and historical consciousness. It is the site of the ancient temple, once considered the most sacred place where the connection between God and humanity was made tangible. Even after its destruction, the memory of that temple has never faded. It continues to live in prayers, in rituals, and in the enduring hope of restoration. For many Jewish people, Jerusalem is not just a historical capital, it is a symbol of covenant, continuity, and belonging. For Christianity, the city carries a different but equally profound meaning. It is the setting for the final chapters in the life of Jesus Christ, the place where his teachings reached their culmination, where his suffering unfolded, and where the Sabutia that define Christian faith are believed to have occurred. Jerusalem, in this sense, is not only a physical location, but a living narrative. Every street, every landmark, becomes a reminder of a story that continues to shape the spiritual lives of millions. In Islam, Jerusalem also holds a revered position. It is home to one of the most significant sacred sites in the Islamic world, connected to traditions that speak of spiritual journeys and divine presence. While Mecca and Medina are central in Islamic practice, Jerusalem remains deeply respected, woven into the broader fabric of Islamic history and belief. For many Muslims, it is not a peripheral place, it is part of a sacred geography that connects heaven, earth, and revelation. And this is where the complexity begins to intensify. Because what happens when multiple communities, each with a deep and legitimate sense of attachment, turn toward the same place and say, "This matters to us in an irreplaceable way"? Unlike ideas, which can coexist in abstraction, physical space is limited. It cannot expand to accommodate every claim without tension. And when that space is not just land, but sacred land, the stakes become even higher. Jerusalem, then, becomes more than a city. It becomes a symbol, a focal point where identity, memory, and belief converge. Any change within it is not perceived as neutral. It is felt. It is interpreted. It resonates across generations. And because each group sees its connection as essential, not optional, compromise becomes extraordinarily difficult. This leads to a sobering conclusion. When the sacred is tied to geography, differences in belief can transform into enduring conflict. Not necessarily because people seek conflict, but because what they are protecting feels fundamental to who they are. In this equation, faith amplifies meaning, and geography limits possibility. The result is a tension that is not easily resolved. As history progresses, this tension does not remain contained within theology or symbolism. It begins to take on another dimension, one shaped by power, influence, and control. Faith does not disappear, but it becomes intertwined with something else, politics. And in this intersection, we begin to see how religious identity can both inspire and justify actions on a much larger scale. One of the most striking examples of this dynamic can be found in the series of conflicts known as the Crusades. At first glance, these campaigns are often described as wars of faith, efforts to reclaim or defend sacred lands. And for many individuals who participated, that motivation was genuine. They believed they were part of a mission that carried spiritual significance, that their actions were aligned with a higher purpose. But if we look more closely, another layer becomes visible. These wars did not occur in a vacuum. They unfolded within a broader context of shifting political power, economic ambition, and territorial competition. Leaders who called for these campaigns were not only appealing to faith, they were also navigating complex geopolitical realities. Control over key regions meant influence, resources, and strategic advantage. This duality reveals something important. The causes of conflict are rarely singular. On the surface, the Crusades can be framed in terms of religion, defending the sacred, fulfilling a divine mission. But beneath that surface lies a network of incentives and interests that extend far beyond theology. Power and faith become intertwined, each reinforcing the other. And this pattern is not unique to one moment in history. It reflects a broader Insani tendency. When belief is combined with identity and authority, it can become a powerful force, capable of uniting people, but also capable of dividing them. The more sacred the cause appears, the more compelling it becomes, and the more easily it can mobilize large groups of people. The consequences of such conflicts do not end when the battles stop. They leave behind something less visible but equally enduring: collective memory. Stories of loss, of struggle, of injustice. These are passed down through generations. They become part of how communities understand themselves and others. And when memory is tied to pain, it can shape perception in ways that are difficult to undo. This is where suspicion begins to take root, not always as an explicit hostility, but as a quiet undercurrent, a sense of distance, of caution, of unresolved tension. Over time, these feelings can accumulate, creating barriers that persist even when the original circumstances have changed. So when we look at conflicts connected to religion, it is not enough to ask what people believe. We also have to ask how those beliefs interact with history, with power, and with memory. Because often, what appears to be a disagreement about faith is also a reflection of deeper dynamics, of identity, of survival, and of the human need to protect what feels essential. If you've followed the journey this far, you're beginning to see how the story evolves from shared origins to complex realities. And if these layers, faith, history, power, are helping you see things in a new way, consider subscribing and following the channel. Not for simple answers, but for deeper questions that challenge how we understand the world. Because the story doesn't end here. The past does not remain in the past. It continues to echo into the present, shaping conflicts that are still unfolding today, conflicts where history, belief, and identity are still deeply intertwined. As the echoes of past conflicts stretch into the present, the story arrives at a point where history is no longer something we simply observe. It becomes something we are still living through. The patterns formed over centuries, shaped by belief, geography, and power, have not disappeared. Instead, they have evolved, condensed, and re-emerged in one of the most complex and enduring conflicts of the modern world: the situation between Israel and Palestine. At first glance, it can be tempting to frame this as a territorial dispute, a disagreement over land, borders, and political control. And while those elements are undeniably present, they do not capture the full reality. Because for the people involved, this is not just about geography, it is about identity, it is about history, and perhaps most profoundly, it is about belief. For many Israelis, the land represents a return, a reconnection to an ancient homeland deeply embedded in Jewish history and tradition. It is tied to narratives of survival, displacement, and the desire for a place of amnit and self-determination after centuries of persecution. The connection is not merely political, it is historical and spiritual, rooted in stories that stretch back thousands of years. For Palestinians, the same land carries a different but equally powerful meaning. It is home, not in an abstract or symbolic sense, but in the lived reality of generations who have built their lives, families, and communities there. Their connection is shaped by memory, by continuity, and by the experience of loss and displacement that has unfolded over the past century. For them, the struggle is not only about land, but about recognition, dignity, and the right to exist as a people. And this is where the complexity becomes most apparent. Both sides are not simply asserting claims, They are expressing deeply held truths about who they are. Each narrative is internally coherent, supported by its own history and experiences. From the outside, there may be a desire to identify a clear answer: who is right, who is wrong. But from within the conflict, such clarity becomes elusive, because both perspectives are rooted in realities that cannot be easily dismissed. This creates a situation where compromise is not just politically difficult, it is emotionally and psychologically challenging. When identity and belief are intertwined with land, any concession can feel like a loss of self. And when both sides experience this simultaneously, the path forward becomes increasingly narrow. Over time, another pattern begins to emerge, one that reinforces the conflict rather than resolving it. It is a cycle, subtle at first, but powerful in its effects. Memory leads to reaction, reaction leads to new conflict, and that conflict creates new memories. These memories are not neutral, they carry emotion, pain, fear, anger, and they shape how each side interprets the actions of the other. This cycle does not require constant escalation to remain active. Even in moments of relative calm, the underlying memories persist, influencing perception and expectation. A single event can be understood not only in its immediate context, but as part of a much longer story. And because that story is different for each side, the same event can produce entirely different interpretations. Breaking such a cycle is extraordinarily difficult. It requires more than agreements or negotiations. It requires a shift in how people relate to their own past, a willingness to acknowledge pain without allowing it to dictate every response in the present. But this is not easy, especially when the past feels unresolved, when justice feels incomplete, and when trust remains fragile. Yet, even within this complexity, there is another layer that often goes unnoticed. Beyond the political narratives and historical grievances, there are individuals, people on both sides, who desire something far simpler: a life without constant tension, without fear, without the burden of ongoing conflict. These voices may not always dominate headlines, but they exist, quietly reminding us that beneath collective identities are shared human experiences. And this brings us to a deeper level of reflection. After tracing the journey from a shared origin through divergence, conflict, and modern tension, a question begins to take shape. Not about specific events, but about the nature of belief itself. What if the root of conflict is not religion in its pure form, but the way it is understood and applied by human beings? This distinction is subtle but significant. Religion, at its core, often points toward ethical principles: compassion, justice, humility, connection to something greater than oneself. But when those principles are interpreted through the lens of history, culture, and personal experience, they can take on different forms. They become embedded in identity, shaped by context, and sometimes used in ways that extend beyond their original intent. In this sense, belief is not a fixed entity. It is a dynamic process, a continuous interaction between text, tradition, and interpretation. Two people can draw from the same source and arrive at different conclusions, not because one is necessarily wrong, but because each is engaging with that source from a different position in time and space. This leads to an important realization. Belief is not absolute in the way it is often perceived. It is influenced by history, by language, by the roof in which it develops. What feels certain within one framework may appear different when viewed from another. And while this does not invalidate belief, it does suggest that our understanding of it is always partial, always situated within a larger context. Recognizing this does not mean abandoning faith or identity. Rather, it opens the possibility of holding those things with greater awareness. It allows for the idea that multiple perspectives can exist simultaneously, each carrying its own meaning and legitimacy. And perhaps more importantly, it creates space for dialogue, not as a way to eliminate differences, but as a way to engage with them more thoughtfully. If you've followed this journey from its earliest beginnings to this point, you've seen how a single origin can unfold into a complex web of beliefs, histories, and conflicts. And if this perspective has helped you see these issues in a new light, consider subscribing and following the channel. Not to simplify the story, but to continue exploring its depth, because understanding is not a destination, it is an ongoing process. And maybe that is where the story ultimately leads us. Not to a final answer about who is right, but to a deeper question about how we live with difference. Because in a world shaped by many beliefs, the challenge is not just to hold on to what we believe, but to understand how those beliefs connect us, divide us, and shape the future we are still creating. As we reach the end of this journey, what remains is not a simple conclusion, but a clearer view of a very long and complex story, one that began with a single origin and gradually unfolded into multiple paths. From the faith of Abraham, a belief in one God emerged, carried forward through generations, shaped by different experiences, and eventually expressed through three major traditions. What started as a unified foundation became three distinct directions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, each preserving part of that origin while also developing its own understanding of truth. And with those different understandings came tension. Not immediately, and not always, but gradually, as interpretations solidified and identities formed around them. Over time, these differences intersected with geography, power, and memory, creating conflicts that extended far beyond theology. From the divergence surrounding Jesus Christ, to the finality associated with Muhammad, to the shared yet contested significance of Jerusalem, the story evolved into something far more intricate than a simple disagreement of beliefs. So what can we take from all of this? Perhaps the most important realization is this: understanding matters more than judgment. When we look at these traditions from a distance, it is easy to reduce them to differences, to focus on where they diverge and to ask which one is correct. But when we look more closely, we begin to see something else. We see that each path is shaped by history, by culture, and by the human need to find meaning. These are not abstract systems. They are lived experiences, carried by people trying to make sense of the world and their place within it. This does not mean that all beliefs are the same, or that differences should be ignored. On the contrary, differences are real, and they matter. But the way we respond to those differences is what ultimately defines the outcome. If the response is judgment, the distance grows. If the response is curiosity, something else becomes possible. That is where dialogue enters, not as a solution that instantly resolves conflict, but as a process that creates space. Space to listen, to question, and to recognize that behind every belief is a story. Dialogue does not require agreement. It requires willingness, the willingness to engage without immediately rejecting, to understand without needing to convert, to coexist without erasing identity. And this brings us to the question that quietly underlies everything we have explored. Is it possible for human beings to hold on to their beliefs while still accepting that others may see the world differently? Not tolerating in the sense of distance, but accepting in the sense of acknowledgement, that different perspectives can exist without needing to cancel each other out. It is not an easy question, because belief is often tied to identity, and identity is something people naturally protect. But perhaps the answer does not lie in weakening belief, but in strengthening awareness, recognizing that our understanding, no matter how deeply held, is still part of a larger and more complex reality. If this journey has given you something to think about, consider subscribing and following the channel for more explorations like this, stories where history, belief, and human experience intersect in unexpected ways. Not to tell you what to believe, but to invite you to look deeper into why beliefs exist as they do. Because in the end, the story is not just about three religions or one shared origin. It is about us, about how we navigate difference, how we carry the past, and how we choose to shape the future.